Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk with you. And I hope it will be a talk with, because my understanding is that I'm to talk for a while, but I've tried to leave enough room so that you all will be able to enter the conversation as well. Now let me see, just make sure I have my technical stuff. I am not a technical person. As I was saying, I was born in 1948, and I think the gene for being technically savvy came around in 1950, okay? So I'm not good at this stuff, but the tech people here have been very helpful, and I want to thank them right off, just to say they helped me a lot and improved the talk a good deal. So let me get the first slide that's mine. That's the title of the talk, Bananas, Onions, and Pomegranates, the Self and Language, and that's me. I teach in the Department of Humanities, and what I teach is ancient Greek literature. And I also teach ancient Greek language as well, which is a lot of fun. But I'm not going to talk about that today at all. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, another area of my research, which is actually closely connected to the work that I do in ancient Greek, but you wouldn't know it. And a little bit of what I want to do is to try to explain at the beginning what the connection is, what philology is, and how come as a philologist who deals in ancient Greek stuff, I'm also just interested in stories and how stories get told. The title of my talk I owe to a friend of mine, Doug Freak, who is a professor in humanities at York, and he and I were riding the bus home together one day some years back, and he turned to me and he asked me, he said, "Do you think of yourself as a banana or an onion?" Well, I hadn't actually thought about that. But I figured that this is what he meant. I think he meant, when you peel a banana, you find a nice, tasty fruit right in the center of it. When you peel an onion, you just keep peeling, right? One layer and then another layer, and you get to the middle and there's nothing. So I think he wanted to ask, which of these descriptions would I apply to myself? Am I a banana or am I an onion? And I thought for a minute, and then I said, neither. I'm a pomegranate. And the point of this talk is to explain why I think of myself as a pomegranate, and to propose that we are all, in fact, pomegranates. This book, by the way, summarizes a book that I published in 2010 called Narrative Structures in the Language of the Self, and I actually have a copy of it here. I don't have any for sale. But just here it is, the real thing. It actually exists, okay? It was kind of interesting because I didn't, most of what I publish is in classics, is in ancient Greek. And I published this, it's totally not in ancient Greek at all. It has nothing to do with it. And it was quite an interesting thing. And as I've worked on this project, I've gotten to know a lot of people in other areas of the academic world. And it's been very, very interesting. To sort of get out of the box that I'm supposed to be in and to get into other boxes. At any rate, Doug's question, to return to that, is, I think, a little bit ambiguous. He could have meant, do you think of yourself as a banana or an onion? Or he could have meant, do you think of yourself as a banana or an onion? Notice that how I split the word here, I not split it here so that yourself is a whole concept. But here, it's the self that's a concept. And I think these are slightly different. Another pair of sentences, I think, suggests that there is a real difference between these two questions. Here are two. Doug thinks of himself as an onion, and Doug thinks of his self as an onion. In the first of these, I think Doug is talking about Doug. But in the second, Doug is talking about Doug's self. Is Doug the same as Doug's self? Now, sometimes we say, gosh, I'm sorry I said that yesterday, I just wasn't myself. I'm sure we've all had that feeling, okay? Or we could say, is this the same? I don't know. Gosh, I'm sorry I said that yesterday, I just wasn't myself. Are those the same or are they different? Well, I'm not quite sure. I'll leave that hanging. The self seems at once essential and elusive. Everyone has a self. But it's not easy to explain exactly what the self is. Is it right to say that one has a self? In that case, if you don't have a self, then what do you have? Or is it better to say that you are a self? And if you're not a self, what are you? It's hard to say what the self is apart from all of the other things that you have or are. Is the self just some undifferentiated substance that all your other qualities somehow stick to? Like it's some sticky thing in the middle, like a banana, right? And all the other qualities that you have stick to it. Or does the self have a quality of its own, some selfness that makes you the person that you are? These all sound like philosophic questions, and indeed philosophers have weighed in on these questions with various answers, and some of these I will mention later in the talk, but I'm not a philosopher. I actually find myself asking questions that philosophers ask, not infrequently, but I never seem to come up with an answer that a philosopher would give. And that's because I'm not a philosopher, I'm a philologist. And in this talk, I want to explore the question of the self not as a question of philosophy, but as a question of philology. Philology is not the best known discipline in the humanities. I'd be very surprised if there are many people here who have much idea of what philology is, and I'll tell you why I'm surprised. I would be surprised. I happened to be on a university committee a few years ago, a committee which brings in people from all different parts of the university. And one of the other people on the committee, whom I didn't know before I was on this committee, she was a linguist. That is someone who deals with linguistics, with language by profession. And she said, "What do you teach?" And I said, "I teach philology." And she looked at me, she gave me this weird look. It was really interesting. And I felt that it was a situation as if she were an astronomer and I said I do astrology. Or if she were a chemist and I said I'm an alchemist, right? And she said to me, "Oh, really?" She said, "I didn't realize that people still studied philology." Well, yes, we do. And the piece of paper that I have at home that says I'm a doctor says that I have a doctorate in classical philology. So I guess I'm a philologist. Well, what is it that philologists do? Historically, philology developed as a method of editing texts in Latin and Greek. Let's say you're digging around in Egypt, okay, where a lot of these manuscripts are found, and you dig up a manuscript, and you say, "Hooray, we have this new wonderful manuscript." Well, then you have to read it. The problem is, it's probably got holes in it. Or some of the pages are missing, or some of the pages have been flipped. That happens not infrequently. Or when it was recopied, because all of these things were written in hand, and they were often copied and recopied many, many, many times. And every time it's recopied, errors creep in. So that one of the things that philologists do is to try to correct those errors, to look at a manuscript and say, well, what should be here? Given what is here, what should be here? The methods of editing these texts are really quite complicated, and they involve a long knowledge of ancient languages, but I thought I could give a couple of examples in modern English that will give you some idea of what I'm talking about. The first is a passage from a novel by Robert Heinlein. Anybody here read Robert Heinlein? Yeah. I love some of his books, not all of them. I love this book. It's a wonderful book called The Puppet Masters. And here is the passage I am interested in. Can you read that? Yeah. Okay, the part that I've marked here, where it says, "Just after, with a sudden burst of grief, I mourned my father." So this is what it reads. "My broken seatbelt was flapping above me. My hands were still tied, and so were my ankles, and one arm seemed to be my head to his. He was bloody and cold, and I was sure that broken. One eye was stuck shut, and it hurt me to breathe. I quit taking stock of my injuries. Dad was no longer plastered against the wheel, and that puzzled me. With painful effort, I rolled my head over to see the rest of the car with my one good eye. He was lying not far from me, 3 feet or so from he was dead. I think it took me about half an hour to cross that 3 feet." Now that doesn't make a lot of sense. Something's wrong, right? Now this is a photograph of the book. This is the photograph of the book page. This is how it appears. You may be interested to know that later editions don't print it this way, okay? But in the edition that I first bought, this is what you see. Now, a philologist would look at that and say, what's wrong? And as it turns out, it's not too hard to figure out, okay, let me go to this one. Yeah, this is the way it should go. My broken seatbelt was flapping above me. My hands were still tied, and so were my ankles, and one arm seemed to be broken. One eye was stuck shut, and it hurt me to breathe. I quit taking stock of my injuries. Dad was no longer plastered against the wheel, and that puzzled me. With painful effort, I rolled my head over to see the rest of the car with my one good eye. He was lying not far from me, about 3 feet or so from my head to his. He was bloody and cold, and I was sure that he was dead. I think it took me about a half hour to cross that 3 feet. Now that makes a lot more sense. What have I done? What I've done is to take line 3, my head to his, and I've moved it down to follow 3 feet or so from my head to his. And that's all I did. Now, it helps to know that printing technology at this time printed a whole line at a time. That's not the way it works now, but they had lead slugs, and it would be a whole line, so that it was fairly easy for a line of type simply to get misplaced in a paragraph, and that's exactly what's happened here. So that's an interesting thing. This is the kind of thing that we deal with in classics all the time, is that we get something where a line has been put in the wrong place, and we have to figure out how to make it right. Now, when you're dealing with an English text like this, it's not so hard. Although I must say, when I give this to my students, they often take 10 or 15 minutes to figure out what the problem is and how to fix it. It's not instantaneous. But if I tell them, they immediately say, oh yeah, right. I hope that's your reaction, okay? Do you agree that the second version is correct and the first version is not? Now the question is, how do we know? And it's in fact not easy to say how we know that the first the version is wrong and the second version is right. Let me go on to another example. This is Stephen King and a book he wrote. This is a nonfiction book of essays collected called Danse Macabre. This passage that I've marked. Not that the past doesn't supply grist for the writer's mill. Of course it does. One example, the most vivid dream I can recall came to me when I was about 8. In this dream, I saw the body of a hanged man dangling from the arm of a scaffold on a hill. Rocks perched on the shoulders of the corpse, and behind it was a noxious green sky boiling with clouds. Would anybody care to say what the problem is?
Are the rocks stayed on the shoulders?
Rocks. Yeah, that's a little odd, isn't it? Okay, there's something wrong with thinking that he's got rocks on his shoulders. Does anybody have a possible conjecture? Rooks. Who said that first? Who was first? What is a rook? It's a bird, okay? It's in the crow family.
At the same time, though, it's a dream, and I'm a shrink, so I would say...
I love it. I love it.
Isn't that part of what you've got to consider is the context?
I couldn't agree more, and I will come back to that. One thing I would say is that if we go down just a little bit, I saw that it was my face rotted and picked by the birds, okay? That, for me, confirms me in my conjecture. But this is an excellent point, by the way, and if he hadn't said it, I would have, but I'm really glad he did, okay? Because philologists are very aware of all of the problems in this kind of interpretation. For example, if we were trying to edit Finnegan's Wake, the works of James Joyce, it would be much different problem to try to figure out what's right and what's wrong. So I don't mean to say that we have unambiguous correct answers always, okay? Sometimes we do have to look at all kinds of issues. And that's one of the things I'm interested in, is what are the kinds of things we have to know in order to come up with plausible reconstructions. There are some people in the literary world who think that we can't do it, that there is in fact no principled basis on which to make this kind of correction. I disagree. I think that we can. I'm not saying that we can do it always with perfect security, okay? But I think that we can make plausible conjectures and then argue about them, okay? And in fact, there's a very important book about an ancient Latin writer, Propertius, which argues that he has been overcorrected by editors and that his text should be left alone because he was an avant-garde writer. And there's a huge controversy because of this. Anyway, that's sort of question period stuff, and I want to keep going. But that's great. So, I've gotten ahead of myself here. So, let me just say, what is it that we're doing when we do this? It takes a certain familiarity with a language in order to make these corrections, and that's why when we're doing it with ancient texts, we have to know a lot of Latin and Greek. But it takes other kinds of knowledge too, and it takes exactly the kind of knowledge that you're talking about, the contextual knowledge. It takes knowledge about history, it takes knowledge about literary genre. For example, I would argue that Stephen King is more likely to write the word rook than some other writers, because I think that rooks fit what he talks about, that kind of macabre kind of atmosphere that he wants. So that I think that it's contextually correct for him as an author to make that correction, whereas for James Joyce it might not be. But all kinds of context, including historical context, social context, all kinds of stuff, in fact, anything we can get hold of is what we use. But the first thing we have to assume is that the text has a meaning. Now that may seem trivial, but as I was saying, there are schools of literary criticism today which argue that texts don't have meaning. Philologists are aware of the difficulties in establishing meaning, but we insist that there is such a thing as meaning, and we want to understand that meaning to the best of our ability. We have to interpret the text, in other words. If we could not interpret texts, if texts had no meaning, we could never know that that first example from Robert Heinlein is a mess, and something has to be done to correct it, and we would never know that the correction is superior. And likewise with the Stephen King passage, if we were not able to interpret language and the text, we would never be aware that there's possibly, I say certainly myself, a problem with rocks and that rooks is better. So in order to get at this meaning, we have to call on a great deal of knowledge that usually is unconscious for us, that we don't think about very much usually. You may not be able to say exactly why the passage from the Puppet Masters doesn't work, but you know, because you know English. Even if that knowledge is mostly unconscious. But you also have to know other things. You have to know, as I was saying, literature, you have to know social context, historical context, all kinds of things. So we're now in a position, let me see where I am. Yes, to consider a few definitions, possible definitions of philology. My first is philology is historical linguistics. In Europe, this would be the normal definition of philology. If you say you're a philologist in Europe, they think you do historical linguistics. That's not what we think in North America by and large. The kind of philology that I do depends on some knowledge of historical linguistics, that is the history of languages and how languages change and develop. But I'm not a linguist myself. I try to know as much linguistics as I can, but what I'm interested in is actually reading a text, whereas a lot of historical linguists never actually read anything. They just tell you what it would look like if it were written 1,000 years ago. So that's one possible definition, but it's not the one that I prefer. This, to me, is a bit better. Philology is the interpretation of texts in context. My previous remarks should have explained what I mean by each of the terms. Interpretation, that is to say, I believe that texts have meaning and that it's our job to get at that meaning somehow. Texts, what I mean by that is that I don't pretend to interpret paintings or music or something like that. Those are wonderful, and I'm perfectly willing to say that they have meaning, but philology isn't interested or doesn't have the tools necessary to tell you what a painting means. That's a different field. So it has a certain modesty. We don't claim to do everything, we just look at texts. And then in context, because philologists believe that you have to know the history, the society, the literary genre in order to figure out what something means. So that's, I think, a pretty good definition of philology, but I would be willing to expand it a little bit to say that philology is literary criticism with a special attention to language. And this is kind of what I feel about myself. My point here is that philology doesn't have to be concerned just with ancient texts. The methods and techniques that we've developed for the interpretation of ancient texts can also be applied to the interpretation of modern texts. And if that's true, then philology is a kind of literary criticism. But it is more specifically the kind of literary criticism that is particularly concerned with language. And this brings me to the second part of my talk. Because you may have been saying, hold on, where'd the self go? Okay, I thought we were talking about bananas and onions and pomegranates here. Well, we are going to, but what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to look at the question of how the self is represented in stories, in narratives, mostly novels. In my book, I talk about some movies as well. I don't think I'm going to be mentioning any today, but I'd be interested if you do. And I'm going to be looking at this question of how the self is represented in narrative using the tools of philology. That is, by paying particular attention to the use of language and trying to say, how does the language in these texts represent what a self is? The question of the self is often thought of as a problem in philosophy, as I said at the beginning. It's also a problem sometimes in psychology. And one of the curious things that's happened to me since I published this book is that psychologists have been writing me notes. And this was quite a surprise to me. And in fact, I was asked to contribute an article to a psychology journal. And whoa, you know, this was out of the blue for me. I had no idea that psychologists would be interested in this. But it turned out that I'm sort of poaching on their territory, at least certain kinds of psychologists. So that was very interesting to me to see that the self is actually claimed by a whole bunch of different disciplines. Anyway, it's thought of often as a problem in philosophy, and I will begin by looking at several models of the self proposed by philosophers and at narrative examples of those, but I'm going to continue by arguing that all of the philosophical models are inadequate. There's nothing I like more than saying that these philosophers don't know what they're talking about. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, storytellers have had a better understanding of the self than the philosophers have had. And I'm going to get at that by trying to look at language. As I go through this, I'm going to be sort of throwing up a model of the self in some somewhat simple terms, and then I'm going to be giving examples of novels or stories that exemplify that model of the self. Now, there are many, I'm just going to be giving a few examples. In my book, I give many more, and there are many more that I could have given. And in fact, it would be interesting if I go through this, for you to say to yourself, oh, he's missed the best example, right? And maybe in the question period, or even, I don't mind being interrupted a bit, you can say, oh, I got a better one, and that would be fine. So, many people at any rate, would say that the modern view of the self begins with the French philosopher René Descartes, who very famously said, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum, although he actually said it in French before he said it in Latin. He said, je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. What he seems to be saying is that what is most certain is his own existence. And on the foundation, because how could he doubt himself? Even if he doubts himself, he has to be there to doubt himself. So his existence is guaranteed even by doubt. So on the foundation of the certainty of his knowledge of his own existence, he builds the rest of everything that he knows, including, for example, his proof of the existence of God, his proof of the existence of the rest of the world, including other people. So the first thing he knows is that he exists, and then he figures out that God exists. It's a very interesting move, philosophically, and changed a lot that he worked this way. The self, then, is the foundation of Descartes' philosophical world. In grammatical terms, Descartes' philosophy is based on the first-person singular pronoun, I. I think, therefore I am. Descartes' view that the self is primary, I think, has repercussions outside formal philosophy. It is also found, for example, in a lot of modern political thought, in which individual rights, for example, are primary, and group rights are secondary or even discounted. When Margaret Thatcher, for example, argued that there is no such thing as society, that is, that there are only individuals, she was taking something like a Cartesian position. I have my wife's cousin teaches philosophy in Manchester, England. Very nice guy named Hillel Steiner. And he wrote a very well-known, very well-regarded book about 15 years ago on rights. And I read it and I thought it was great and really interesting, and I learned a lot from it. And one thing I noticed is that he had no discussion of group rights in his whole book. And so I said to him the next time I saw him, I said, how come you don't talk about group rights? He says, because there are none. And I was really shocked at that, because I had always assumed that groups can have rights. He said, absolutely not, that so far as he was concerned, only individuals can have rights. And I think that's a fundamentally kind of Cartesian position, staking everything on the first person singular pronoun I. So you can say I have rights, but you can't say we have rights or they have rights. I've suggested then that there's a grammatical way to look at the Cartesian philosophy, that it is a philosophy built on the first person singular pronoun. I would also suggest that the Cartesian self shows up in literature, in narrative. And I think that there are quite a few novels which seem to portray this Cartesian self. These are novels which concentrate on the experience of being an individual. And here are just a few that I happen to think of. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. Very disturbing, troubling book about a person who's really disengaged from the society in which he lives, and thinks of himself as living underground. Sartre's novel Nausea. Again, Sartre is a philosopher, and actually it's interesting to note that this novel is based in some of his philosophic ideas. And again, it's a person who's unconnected, who can't make sense of how he relates to other people. William Golding, who's most famous for, what's it called? Lord of the... Thank you very much. He wrote a really interesting book called Pincher Martin, in which it takes place in the Second World War, and the character in it is shipwrecked. And the only character in the whole of the book, except for the last page, is this one character as he's shipwrecked and dying, remembering his life. But all of the other people are simply his memories. And it's a very, very interesting effect. And again, it has this sense of I'm all alone. And that, I think, is the feeling that we get for a lot of these, what I'm calling Cartesian narratives, is that they have this feeling of I'm all alone. And that, I think, is what's happening in these stories, is that they're putting the flesh of real life onto the bare bones of the Cartesian self. They're saying narratively, if Descartes' right, what does it feel like? And the answer, unfortunately, is not so great, right? That Cartesian self is kind of isolated and lonely. It's just me. Now, when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, he probably meant something more like, I observe myself thinking, and therefore I conclude that I must exist. Okay? I think that's sort of a longer version that unpacks some of what he means. This more expansive form of the Cartesian argument introduces a slight, but I think very important complication. In grammatical terms, in addition to the first person singular pronoun, this form of the statement also includes the first person reflexive pronoun, myself. I observe myself thinking, and therefore I include that I must exist. In this, the self turns back on itself to look at itself. And we can also say it turns back on itself to look at its self. Descartes' argument assumes that the I observing myself is the same self as the self in myself. Let me do that again, okay? Descartes' argument assumes that the I observing myself is the same self as the self in myself. Does that make a little sense? Just kind of get what I'm getting at there? It assumes that the observing self is identical to the self which is observed. In the short form, I think, therefore I am, this assumption is too deeply buried to be easily noticed. But in the longer form, I observe myself thinking, and therefore I conclude that I exist, this introduces this new term, the reflexive pronoun, and that makes it possible to ask the question, is the I the same as myself? A little reflection, if I can excuse that pun, a little reflection shows that these two terms may not be identical. For example, there may be a slight passage of time between the I which observes the myself and the myself which is observed. If you look at yourself in a mirror, presumably the self you see is just a little bit younger than the observing self by the same time that the photons take to get across to your eye. Now, that's not a lot of time, I grant you, okay? You don't age a lot in that. Well, these days I think I do, but anyway. But in general, we're now very aware of the observer effect. For instance, when anthropologists go off to study some small-scale society, they can usually only study a society which now includes an anthropologist. And a society which includes an anthropologist may not behave the way a society behaves when it doesn't have an anthropologist living there. And the same thing is true even in physics, that observing little teeny particles may in fact have an effect on them, that the energy, don't ask me to explain that, okay? I don't know, okay, that's what they tell me. Okay, but in fact, in a lot of narratives, we do see this. An example is Great Expectations by Dickens, which is narrated by Pip talking about himself as he was young. And there's a real important question there. Is the Pip that he's narrating the same as the Pip who is doing the narrating? And the difference between the young Pip and the older Pip is essential to what the story is about. And I think this is true of us all when we think about ourselves at an earlier stage of my life. And you can say, was that really me who did all those things back in the 1960s, you know? Whoa, come on. Yeah. So, a person observing himself is, I think this is a really important thing. And for example, it may be one of the differences, say, between dogs and people. I love dogs and I think dogs are really smart, but I don't think dogs have that kind of self-reflection. My dog never says, you know, I'm sorry I did that, I wasn't myself. She just says, you know, give me another treat, okay? That kind of self-reflection, I think, is what we have as human beings that other animals, by and large, don't have, although perhaps some other primates have some ability to do that. A person observing himself or herself may become a different person simply by the act of self-reflection, self-observation. It changes you to observe yourself in a way that my dog does not change because she doesn't observe herself. And I think that's a very important fact of being a human being. In a sense, we might say that the self has become divided. And in a sense, that's what the reflexive pronoun indicates, this kind of division within the self. One of the best illustrations of this that I can think of is Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And in this story, the respected good citizen Dr. Jekyll finds that by taking a potion, which he has mixed up, he can change himself into the evil criminal Mr. Hyde and then back again into Dr. Jekyll. Eventually, however, he finds that the transformation to Mr. Hyde becomes permanent. And as the story ends, we also learn that even the good Dr. Jekyll had a shady part of his life, and the transformation into the evil Mr. Hyde was only making manifest something that was always there in his character. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a classic example of what is called literature of the double. There's a huge body of literature on stories about the double. There are hundreds of stories about these, and if we were to take a few minutes, I'm sure we could come up with a whole lot. Well, actually, my other two are not quite so much literature of the double, but they're related. In some stories of the double, as in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the double is a single self who somehow becomes divided. A superhero who has a disguise would be another form of this double. But in other stories, the double may be a pair of twins, sometimes identical twins, but in this situation, usually there's a good twin and an evil twin. In others, the doubles are not twins, but siblings. Sometimes the doubles are not related, but born on the same day. There's a wonderful short story by Poe called William Wilson. If you think of the title William Wilson, the initials are WW, which is kind of neat. And it's a story about two people who are born on the same day and are doubles. Sometimes the doubles are antagonists, and sometimes these antagonists fight to the death, as we have find in Conan Doyle, The Adventure of the Final Problem, where Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty battle to the death. All of these are variations on this theme, the theme of the double, with varying distances between the two halves of the double. Are there other examples anybody can come up with very quickly? Stories about doubles? Yes?
I think probably one of the best examples is the movie The Matrix, where Neo, nobody really knows that they're unconnected.
Yeah.
And Neo discovers, hey, I'm unconnected, and he's really two people. He's able to see his self in reality and also see his self in the Matrix.
That's great.
Yeah.
Anybody got another one? There was a really horrible, wonderful, horrible movie some years back called Face Off. Anybody see Face Off? Okay. Yeah, I need say no more. You know, it's not a great movie, although it's a wonderful movie. But it is such a perfect example of this doubling feature and the switching of identities and who is who that we come up with in literature of the double. Now, this model of the self is either divided or part of a double, finds its philosophic model in the German philosopher Hegel. In his book called The Phenomenology of the Spirit, he tells a little story, very famous story in philosophic circles, a story about a master and a bondsman, or a master and a servant, or a master and a slave, depending upon the translation. According to this fable, self-consciousness, that is self-awareness, being aware of yourself, comes because of the confrontation of one consciousness with another. If there were only one consciousness, he argues, that consciousness would never become self-aware. It's only when this consciousness meets up with another consciousness that it says, hold on, I am different from that other consciousness. According to Hegel, these two consciousnesses then fall into a struggle for domination. And this is a struggle to the death. One consciousness eventually, however, surrenders to the other through its greater attachment to life. The victor in this contest then becomes the master, and the vanquished becomes the slave or the bondsman. But the position of the slave, he says, turns out to be actually superior, or at least more favorable for the further development of consciousness. The master's self-consciousness is stymied because the master is dependent on the slave, both for recognition and also for material satisfactions. But the slave, because of its experience of the fear of death and through its own work in the material world as it serves the master, comes to achieve an understanding of itself, a deeper understanding of itself as self-consciousness. This rather elaborate philosophic fable, or should I say fantasy, matches pretty closely the plots of many stories of the double, and it's kind of interesting to see that. There are certainly variations, partly depending on the form the doubling takes in a particular story, but it's easy to see the general form of this fable in many stories, from the struggle to the death between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, to the struggle to the death between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Moriarty, and so on. There are many, many of these that have been written. All of these stories are examples of what I call the Hegelian self, the self which has become divided and which enters into competition with another self. One might wonder, I wonder when I read this piece of Hegel, why this confrontation always has to be antagonistic. He never explains this. Can't we just get along? You know? He assumes no. He says it always has to be a struggle to the death. But I think we can find a model of doubling based on affection in another philosopher, and this is Plato. In his dialogue, The Symposium, one of his characters, it's actually supposedly the comic poet, dramatist Aristophanes who tells the story. Originally, people as we know them now are just half of what people were originally, according to Aristophanes. The first human beings, he said, were actually two. And the first human beings had 2 heads, 4 arms, 4 legs, and a round body. Okay? But the gods got mad at people for some reason and decided that they would split them in half. Okay? And according to Aristophanes, we've all been divided, and we all wander around the world looking for our other halves. Okay? Now, how seriously Plato meant this, I'm not sure he did mean it seriously at all. But it's an interesting other version of the flip side of the Hegelian story, because it says, yes, there is another half out there, but you want that other half, and your life, what you're doing in your life is seeking that other half. This model of the double is the model found in some love stories, where the two lovers feel that they are incomplete without each other. And the example that I've given is Charlotte Bronte's great novel Wuthering Heights, in which Cathy explicitly says that she and Heathcliff are really the same person. But you can find this in a number of love stories, sometimes more strongly stated, sometimes less. Now, if the grammar of the Cartesian self is the first person singular pronoun I, the grammar of the Hegelian or Platonic double is the first person and the second person, I and you, or some people would say I and thou to make it clear that it's a singular second person. Sometimes people talk about this as the self and the other, or the subject and the object. I think these are all ways of talking about the same thing. This confrontation of an I and a thou is basic to many schools of modern philosophy, and it is also fundamental to many narratives. And again, what I think is happening is that the narratives are putting the flesh of real life onto the bones of philosophy. Now, the next model of the self, since I've done the first person singular and I've done the first person singular and the second person singular, it ought to include the third person singular. And that's exactly right. These are stories, for instance, in which two antagonistic selves struggle for possession of a third self, as in the typical romantic triangle. I and you are fighting over her. Or you can change the genders around variously. The philosophic model for these stories is found in Freud. First, in the Oedipus complex, in which there is a struggle between the father and son for the affections for the mother, but also in a story Freud tells in Totem and Taboo, in which brothers struggle for the possession of a woman. Do I have? Yes. So these are just a few examples of romantic triangle stories. I put Oedipus the king because of the Oedipus complex. It doesn't quite work that way in the play, but you know, Freud, I think, says we should talk about this. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote a wonderful book, which you may not know, called The Master of Ballantrae. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. If you don't know it, I really recommend it. And in this story, two brothers are struggling for the affections of a woman. And the whole novel works out who is going to get her in a really wonderful way. The thing that's interesting about this is that it has the doubling feature, because the two brothers are a form of the double, and then the woman that they're fighting over is actually their cousin. It's quite an interesting story. Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence I put on because it changes the genders. In this story, two women are struggling for the affections of a man. So it doesn't have to be two men and a woman. There's a wonderful story. I didn't realize this soon enough to put it on my PowerPoint. There's a wonderful novel by Vladimir Nabokov, the title of which is King, Queen, Knave. And the title says it all. Right? It just lays the whole thing out. King, queen, knave. Three people. A king, the queen, that's mother and father, and the knave is the interloper who's trying to get the affections of the queen and steal the queen away from the king. It's a great novel, really, really interesting. With this Freudian model added to the Cartesian and Hegelian models, we have run out of pronouns. At least we've run out of singular pronouns. So what am I going to do? Okay? Well, one thing is I can go into plurals. And in effect, that I think is an important move. There's a very interesting and important book by George Herbert Mead, who was a sociologist, originally published in 1934, Mind, Self, and Society from the Standpoint of a Social Behaviorist. It's a wonderful book. And in this book, he develops a model of what he calls the social self, in which the self is defined through all of its social relations. And his model is a sports team, let's say a baseball team. And the role of the shortstop is defined not in absolute terms, but in relationship to the other players, in relationship to the second baseman, the first baseman, the pitcher, and even in relationship to the people on the other team if they're on base. And something like this, Mead says, is true for the development of the self in society, that your self is defined not as an individual object, but in its relations with other people, just as the shortstop is defined in relationship to the other players. So as we move beyond the three philosophic models towards more complex models, we need a new terminology. We need things like shortstop and first baseman to talk about the roles that a self can play in society. So in order to do this, I went once again to grammar and looked at some grammatical terms. In grammar, for example, the first thing I looked at was three terms called agent, patient, and experiencer. These are three different forms that a subject, for example, or an object can take in a sentence. In the sentence, George tripped Sam, George is the agent of the action and the subject of the sentence, and Sam is the direct object and the patient. Right? George tripped Sam. Who's doing it? George is doing it. To whom was it done? It was done to Sam. And in English, we can transform this into the passive voice. Sam was tripped by George. Here the subject is the patient of the action and the agent is expressed in a prepositional phrase. But there are also sentences in which the subject is not clearly either an agent or a patient. If I take, for example, the intransitive sentence, Sam tripped, it isn't the case that someone is tripping Sam, so that there's no agent there, but it's also not quite the case that he's the object of someone else's action. He's experiencing this tripping. Right? There are other examples of this. For example, sleeping. George slept. Sleeping isn't, you're not really an agent, you're not really a patient. What are you? You're an experiencer. So this is a term that grammarians have come up with to talk about this third possibility of being, of the self in a sentence, a subject in a sentence. And here are some examples of stories which I think are organized around this idea. In the James Bond stories, Bond is an agent, right? He is the agent, right? Franz Kafka, in the trial, his major character is always, he never can do anything himself. He just has to put up with what's happening to him as he is put on trial for something that he doesn't even know what's happening. But there's always this sense of being pushed around, being the object rather than the agent. And Virginia Woolf writes books in which nothing ever happens, but people just are, but people are very aware of themselves. They are experiencing the world. I happen to love this book, so I can make gentle fun of it because I love it. But I think that's true. I think that these are not just things that happen in stories. I think that these are things that happen in life. I think that sometimes we feel like agents, and sometimes we feel that we're not agents, that we're not in control, things are happening to us. And then sometimes we just stop and smell the roses. I mean, those are all part of life. And in any given story, a character may well move very quickly from one of these to another. So in these, there's a tendency for the whole story to be organized a particular way. But in many stories, there's a shift back and forth. Now, English doesn't show these cases at the surface level very much. In other languages do show cases at the surface much more than English does. For example, Latin and Russian have 5 or 6 cases. In English, we really only have 2 cases for nouns. We have the possessive case, and then we have the case that does everything else. Pronouns, there's a little bit more. But in Russian, there are 6 cases, I believe. Finnish has 15 cases, so I hear. Hungarian has 17. Now, I don't know Finnish or Hungarian, but that's what people tell me. Even though English doesn't show these cases at the surface, some linguists argue that the cases are present in what's called deep structure. The dative case, for example, fundamentally expresses the position of a person who is interested in what is going on but is not an active participant. This is sometimes called the dative of interest. For example, let's imagine somebody is running a race, and I've bet on him, okay? I've bet $5 he's going to win the race. And as he comes near to the end of the race, I see that he's beginning to slow down. I might shout out to him, "Don't give up on me." Well, that on me is the dative of interest. I'm not doing the running, he's doing the running, but I have an interest in it because I placed a bet on him, right? So that on me construction in Latin or in Russian would be a dative, okay? In English, we just use on me. There are some other interesting examples of that. For example, even the word please in English is probably an example of the dative of interest. What do you mean when you say please? You mean something like, I have an interest in what's going on here, even though I'm not going to be the person doing it. Please don't smoke means I would rather, I have an interest in whether you smoke or not. In The Great Gatsby, the major character is, of course, Jay Gatsby, but the story is told by Nick Carraway. He's the witness of the story. And there are quite a few stories written this way. Another very interesting example is Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in which Randall Patrick Murphy is the big hero of the story, but it's told by Chief Broom, who is observing what's going on. And what's interesting about that book is that at the very end, there's a transfer, and Chief Broom becomes the agent rather than simply the dative of interest, the witness character. There's another case, a grammatical case, called the instrumental case. Again, it's found in a number of languages. It's in Latin, usually expressed in the ablative. This is the case of just something you, for example, a key. If you say, the janitor opened the door with a key, in Latin you would use the ablative case to indicate that that's a tool, an instrument that you're using. In English, interestingly enough, we can even make that the subject of the sentence and say, the janitor's key opens this door, which is kind of interesting. So I said to myself, can an instrument be the subject of a novel? And yeah, I think so. There's a wonderful novel which was made into a pretty interesting movie called The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, written in the 1950s. And the hero of this story is a little 12-year-old boy who is spending the summer at a friend's house, a big summer house, a big mansion in rural England. And he is used by two people who are carrying on an illicit affair to take messages back and forth to each other. So he is the go-between, and he is the tool that they use in order to make their assignations. Now, he's the hero of the story. And in fact, one of the crucial moments in the story comes when he fears that they are regarding him not as a real person, but only as a tool for their own desires. It's a very, very good book, and I recommend it highly, but it shows that sometimes a person is an instrument of other person's desires. There's another case, grammatical case, called the locative case. This is the case of location. In English, for example, we can say that George is cold, and we can say Chicago is cold. We can say it's cold in Chicago, but we don't ordinarily say it's cold in George. All right, the reason is that George is in the experiencer case, whereas Chicago is in the locative case. So I said to myself, as I was doing this project, are there situations in which a location takes on some kind of selfness? And I said, yeah, I think so. And an example is in E.M. Forster's book, Howard's End. And Mrs. Wilcox in this book is tremendously identified with the house where she lives, which is called Howard's End. And as the story progresses, she dies, and the house becomes the property eventually at the end of the book of another character who actually who marries Mrs. Wilcox's widow and becomes Mrs. Wilcox. And that transfer is also a transfer to her identification with the property. So it's a very interesting situation where sometimes people are very closely identified with a particular location. I think this was perhaps more true in days when we didn't move around so much, that people had this feeling of identification with a place. But I think it does show up sometimes in life that people feel very identified with a particular house or with a particular country. That's another kind of identification that you can have. So, these then are the kinds of self that I have identified: the Cartesian self, the Hegelian Platonic self, the Freudian self, the agent self, the patient self, the experiencer self, the dative of interest self, that is the witness, the instrumental self, and the locative self. I don't claim, well, before that, what I've tried to suggest that each one of these kinds of self is explored in literature. in various narratives, in various novels, in various movies, where there is some kind of exploration of what it means to be one of these sorts of a self. I also think that these are not just literary constructs. I think that these are things that we feel in our lives. Sometimes you may feel as if you're a Cartesian self, all alone in the world. I certainly have felt that at times. Sometimes you may feel a special connection for good or bad with one other person, as in the Hegelian Platonic self. Sometimes, unfortunately, you may find yourself caught in a romantic triangle. It does happen. Sometimes you may feel that you're the agent of your actions, of some story that's going on, but sometimes you may feel that other people are pushing you around. Sometimes you just spend time experiencing the world. Sometimes you may be watching a situation unfold even though you're not really playing a direct role yourself, so you are a witness, a dative of interest. Sometimes you may feel that other people are just using you. Now that's not always bad, because in fact sometimes you want to help other people. Sometimes you may feel a kind of a bond with a particular place, your childhood home or your bedroom or something like that. All of these are ways of being a self or having a self. And once you start to think about these various ways of being a self, it's interesting to say, at any given moment, in any given situation, what kind of a self am I being right now? Is it a self I'm happy to be? Would I like to try to be a different self in this situation? How am I treating the people around me? Do I reduce other people to instruments when I should be recognizing them as agents? And one of the functions of storytelling, I think, is to give us examples of these various ways of being a self. Now, I certainly don't claim that I've exhausted all the possible ways of being a self. There may be many more kinds of self. There may be a countless number of different selves that manifest themselves in different situations. A complete list, therefore, may be impossible, and it may be that there are as many types of self as there are situations to be in. And it may be that the examples I've given are just rough groupings of an infinite variety of selves. But my argument is that when you peel back the skin of yourself, what you find is not a banana, is not an onion, but what you find is a multitude of possible selves. And that's why I told my friend Doug that I think of myself not as a banana, not as an onion, but as a pomegranate. Thank you.